I took the vineyard job because I needed money, not because I had some romantic dream about endless rows of grapes and golden sunsets. College tuition had eaten through my savings. My old cafe job disappeared when the place closed unexpectedly, and by the middle of May I was calculating whether I could stretch a box of pasta across 3 dinners. When I found an online listing that simply read, "Seasonal vineyard worker needed. Housing included. Competitive pay. Ages 21 plus." I applied within 5 minutes. 3 days later, I was driving 2 hours away from the city toward a valley I'd never visited before. The vineyard looked exactly like something printed on the front of an expensive wine bottle. Long green rows stretched across rolling hills. A huge white farmhouse overlooked the property, while several smaller buildings sat farther down the hill beside an old stone winery. Everything looked peaceful, organized, expensive. I immediately felt underdressed. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I parked beside a faded pickup truck. Before I could even step out, someone knocked twice on my window. "You must be Preston." I looked up. The man standing outside wasn't much older than me. Maybe 26 or 27. Tall, dark blonde hair that looked permanently windswept. Tan skin from spending every day outside. Blue eyes that somehow looked serious and amused at the same time. He wore worn jeans, muddy boots, and a gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled above his forearms. "I'm Theodore," he said after I climbed out. "Everyone calls me Theo." I shook his hand. "Nice to meet you." His handshake was firm, not overly friendly, not cold, just confident. "You find the place okay?" GPS almost sent me into a cornfield. He laughed. "Yeah, happens a lot." It was a nice laugh. Easy, natural, not loud enough to demand attention. "You hungry?" I stopped for gas station food. He made a face. "So yes, I guess. We'll fix that later." There was something about the way he said it that instantly relaxed me. Not flirting, not overly warm, just welcoming. He grabbed one of my bags before I could protest. "I can carry that." "I know." He kept walking anyway. My grandmother would yell at me if I let the new guy carry everything. "Your grandmother?" "She owns the vineyard." That surprised me. I thought, "What? I don't know. You expected some 80-year-old guy named Richard?" I laughed. "Maybe." "Nope." He pointed toward the large farmhouse. "That's where she lives." Then toward a smaller building behind it. "You'll stay there." The worker's cottage looked better than my apartment. Wood floors. Large shared kitchen. 4 bedrooms. Front porch overlooking the vines. "It's usually full during harvest," Theodore explained. "But right now, just you and me." I blinked. "Really? The other seasonal workers arrive in August. So don't worry." He smiled. I snore loud enough for 4 people. The first afternoon was mostly paperwork. Safety instructions. Emergency contacts. Schedules. The vineyard covered nearly 100 acres. They produced several different grape varieties, sold wine across the state, and hosted weddings almost every weekend. "We're busy," Theodore said while leading me through the property. "Very." He seemed to know every single inch of the place. Every irrigation pipe, every storage shed, every vine. "Been working here long?" "My whole life." I looked at him. "You grew up here?" He nodded. "My grandparents bought the land before I was born. And now, I manage everything outside." He shrugged. "My grandmother handles the business side." "You like it?" He looked across the vineyard before answering. "Some days." Only 2 words. But something about the pause before them stayed with me. The work started early. Very early. At 5:30 the next morning, someone knocked gently on my bedroom door. "You alive?" "Theodore." "Barely." "Coffee." "I'm listening." "Kitchen." He disappeared before I answered. When I stumbled downstairs 15 minutes later, he already had 2 mugs waiting. "You drink it black?" "I'll drink motor oil at this hour." He laughed again. "I'll remember that." Breakfast was simple. Eggs, toast, fruit. Then we headed outside. I had never realized how much work happened before grapes were even harvested. Pruning, checking irrigation, removing damaged leaves, inspecting vines, repairing supports. Hours passed surprisingly quickly, mostly because Theodore never stopped explaining things. "These vines are older. This section gets more morning sun. Don't pull that one. Definitely don't step there." I followed him everywhere, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just listening. "You actually like teaching." He looked surprised. "What makes you say that?" "You explain everything like you want people to understand." He shrugged. "I guess nobody taught me." So you figured it out yourself? Mostly. There was pride in his voice. Quiet pride. The kind that doesn't need applause. Around noon, we stopped beneath a large oak tree overlooking the valley. The view was incredible. Rows of vines disappeared into the distance. The farmhouse looked tiny from here. The summer air smelled warm and sweet. Theodore handed me a sandwich. My grandmother insists everyone eats. I won't argue. You'd lose. I believe it. We sat there in comfortable silence. Not awkward. Just peaceful. Finally, I asked, so why aren't there more workers now? They'll come closer to harvest. And until then, you get me. He smiled. Lucky you. I laughed. You're very confident. I'm realistic. Days started blending together. Wake up. Coffee. Work. Lunch beneath the oak tree. More work. Dinner. Sleep. It should have become repetitive. Instead, I found myself looking forward to mornings. Not because I suddenly loved physical labor. I definitely didn't. My muscles hurt constantly. My hands developed blisters. I fell asleep almost immediately every night. But Theodore somehow made every day feel different. He noticed everything. A hawk circling overhead. Rain arriving hours before clouds appeared. Wild deer hiding between trees. The first grapes beginning to change color. You really love this place. He looked across the vineyard. I complain about it constantly. That's not an answer. It kind of is. He smiled without looking at me. I've tried leaving. You have. Twice. What happened? I came back. Because. He took a long breath. It feels strange being anywhere else. Friday evening brought the vineyard's first wedding of the season. Most workers helped prepare tables, move chairs, and decorate the outdoor reception area. I expected Theodore to supervise. Instead, he was carrying heavy wooden tables beside everyone else. You're the manager. So, you could tell people what to do. I am. He lifted another table. I'm telling myself. By sunset, everything looked incredible. String lights hung between trees. White flowers decorated every table. Music floated across the vineyard. The guests began arriving dressed far better than anyone working there. Theodore leaned against the fence beside me. They always look happier than they actually are. The wedding guests. The couples. I glanced toward him. That's cynical. It's experience. You know them? I've watched nearly 200 weddings happen here. And he watched the bride and groom walking together across the lawn. People promise forever really easily. His voice had changed. Quieter. More thoughtful. What about you? What about me? You believe in forever? He looked at me for several seconds. Long enough that I wondered if I'd crossed some invisible line. Finally, he smiled. I believe in showing up tomorrow. That's it. Tomorrow becomes next week. And then, eventually, he shrugged. Maybe that's forever. Before I could answer, someone across the lawn shouted his name. Theo. He sighed dramatically. Duty calls. He started walking away before stopping. Oh. I looked up. Glad you took the job. It sounded casual, like something anyone might say. But for some reason, I watched him walk away longer than I probably should have. And I couldn't explain why. The first weekend passed faster than I expected. Saturday morning started with rain. Not the dramatic kind that comes with thunder and heavy winds. Just a slow, steady rain that settled over the vineyard like a blanket. Instead of working outside, Theodore showed me the winery. The old stone building smelled like oak barrels, fresh wood, and something rich I couldn't quite identify. Fermentation, he explained after noticing me trying to figure it out. It always smells different depending on the season. I looked around. Huge stainless steel tanks lined one wall. Rows of oak barrels disappeared into dimly lit storage rooms. Bottles rested in wooden racks, stretching almost from floor to ceiling. I didn't realize how much happens after the grapes. He smiled. Most people don't. He handed me a pair of work gloves. Come on. What are we doing? Cleaning barrels. Sounds exciting. It isn't. I appreciate your honesty. Cleaning barrels turned out to be exactly as exciting as Theodore promised. Not at all. But somehow we still spent 3 hours laughing. Mostly because I was terrible at everything. You missed a spot. I absolutely didn't. You definitely did. I refuse to believe you. He walked over, looked inside the barrel for less than 2 seconds, then pointed. There. I sighed dramatically. You planned this. I actually didn't. I think you had dirt in there. Preston. Yes. You sound like a child. I feel like one. He laughed so hard he had to lean against another barrel. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh that openly. No restraint. No quiet smile. Just genuine amusement. It made me grin without meaning to. What? He caught me looking. Nothing. Liar. I was just. What? I hesitated. I don't think I've seen you laugh like that. He looked unexpectedly embarrassed. I laugh. You smile. Same thing. It isn't. For a second, he didn't answer. Then he quietly admitted, maybe not. By afternoon, the rain had stopped. The vineyard smelled fresh. Everything seemed greener than before. Theodore suggested we check one of the upper fields. It'll be muddy. I noticed. You complaining? I'm preparing excuses. Good. He tossed me another pair of boots. You'll need them. The climb up the hill wasn't difficult. The mud made it entertaining. Mostly because I slipped twice within the first 5 minutes. The second time, Theodore caught my arm before I landed face first. You okay? Physically. That's usually the important part. I'll survive. He didn't let go immediately. Neither of us seemed to notice. Then, almost at the same time, we stepped apart. The moment lasted maybe 3 seconds. Still, for the rest of the walk, I kept thinking about it. Not because anything happened. Nothing had. But somehow it felt like something almost had. When we reached the highest point of the vineyard, Theodore stopped walking. Best view. He wasn't wrong. The valley stretched for miles. The vines rolled across the hills like waves. Small farms dotted the landscape. In the distance, mountains faded into blue haze. I come here when I need to think. You think a lot. Too much. I laughed. Same. He leaned against the wooden fence. So. You never answered. I didn't. Why college? I looked across the valley. I always wanted to design buildings. Architecture. Yeah. You still do. I think so. You don't sound convinced. I spent so much time trying to get there. I shrugged. I never really asked if I still wanted it. He nodded slowly. I understand that. You do? I inherited this place. You don't want it? I didn't say that. But sometimes I wonder if choosing something is different from never having another option. The words lingered between us. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, I asked, if you could leave tomorrow? He smiled faintly. I'd probably come back. You really are attached. I told you. He looked across the vines. This place gets into your bones. That evening, Theodore cooked dinner. Or at least, he claimed he cooked. I'm helping. He looked over his shoulder. You're making salad. That's helping. It's preventing disasters. I can cook. You almost set toast on fire yesterday. It was aggressive toast. There is no such thing. There absolutely is. He shook his head. I don't know how you survive alone. I order food. That explains everything. Dinner ended up surprisingly good. Mostly because Theodore actually knew what he was doing. Afterward, we sat on the porch watching lightning flash far beyond the hills. No rain reached us. Just distant storms. You miss the city? He asked it casually. I thought about it. My friends. Not the city. I miss people. He nodded. Yeah. What about you? What about me? You ever get lonely out here? He answered too quickly. Not really. I looked at him. He noticed. What? That wasn't true. He smiled without humor. I'm around people all day. That's different. It usually is. The silence that followed felt heavier than usual. Finally, he admitted. Sometimes. Sometimes what? I finish work. He looked toward the dark vineyard. And then the place gets quiet. You live here all year. Yeah. That has to be strange. It becomes normal. Normal doesn't always mean good. He looked at me. Really looked. Then quietly said, no, it doesn't. Sunday afternoon, we drove into the nearby town for supplies. Population, maybe 3,000 people. One grocery store. One diner. One gas station. One hardware shop. Everyone seemed to know Theodore. Theo, morning. How's your grandmother? You fixing the north fence this week? He answered every question patiently. By the time we reached the grocery store, I'd counted at least 12 conversations. You're famous. I'm trapped. Same thing. Definitely not. Inside the store, an older woman smiled brightly at Theodore. Oh, who's this? He glanced toward me. This is Preston. The new worker? Yep. She smiled warmly. Welcome. Thank you. Then she looked between us for half a second before smiling again. You boys staying busy? Theodore answered immediately. Always. After we walked away, I noticed he seemed unusually quiet. You okay? You disappeared. I'm fine. You sure? He nodded. But something had changed. On the drive home, I finally asked, can I ask something? You usually do. The woman at the store. What about her? You got nervous. He kept his eyes on the road. I didn't. You absolutely did. He sighed. She's known me since I was 5. So, so small towns notice everything. I frowned. I don't follow. He hesitated longer than I expected. Finally, he shrugged. People like making stories. About everyone. I waited. He didn't continue. The conversation ended there. But the answer somehow raised more questions than it solved. Monday arrived with another early morning. Only this time Theodore wasn't in the kitchen. Instead, an older woman stood at the stove flipping pancakes. She smiled the second I walked in. So, you must be Preston. You must be Theodore's grandmother. I suppose that gives me away. She laughed. I'm Margaret. Nice to meet you. You too. She pointed toward the table. Sit. I can help. You can eat. I like this arrangement. So do I. A few minutes later, Theodore walked inside carrying fresh strawberries. Morning. He looked from me to his grandmother. I see you've already been adopted. Margaret smiled proudly. He actually says thank you. You set the bar very low. I raised you. I know. She reached over and gently straightened the collar of his work shirt without thinking. The gesture lasted only a second. It felt incredibly familiar. Comfortable. Theodore didn't even react. You spoil him, I said. Margaret smiled knowingly. No. I remind him someone notices when he forgets to take care of himself. Theodore rolled his eyes. I'm 28. And you still forget breakfast. I remembered strawberries. For everyone else. She looked at me. You'll have to make sure he eats. Theodore groaned. Please don't recruit him. No promises. I laughed. I think I'm on her side. I noticed. For the first time since arriving, the vineyard felt less like a workplace and a little more like home. The realization caught me completely off guard. By the beginning of my 3rd week, I had stopped thinking of the vineyard as a temporary job. That realization bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I had come here to earn money. Nothing more. Work for 3 months. Go back to the city. Finish college. Continue with the life I'd already planned. Simple. At least. That was supposed to be the plan. Instead, I caught myself measuring time by sunrises over the vines instead of calendar dates. I knew exactly which row Theodore liked to inspect first every morning. I knew which coffee mug he always reached for without looking. I knew he hummed quietly whenever he repaired fences, even though he insisted he couldn't sing. And somehow, without noticing when it happened, those little things had become important to me. Tuesday started badly. Not because of work. Because I overslept. When I rushed downstairs nearly 40 minutes late, I expected Theodore to already be outside. Instead, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with a newspaper and an untouched mug of coffee. He looked up. Morning. I stopped halfway across the room. You waited? He shrugged. I figured something happened. You could have started. I could have. He folded the newspaper. But then you'd spend the whole day apologizing. Probably. So this seemed easier. I stared at him for a second. You really know me already. I've watched you try opening the refrigerator with your truck keys. That happened once. Twice. I'd like to object. You can't. He stood, grabbed his hat, and handed me a fresh travel mug. I made another pot. You didn't have to. I know. There it was again. That habit he had. Doing thoughtful things as if they were completely ordinary. As if everyone would do the same. That day's project involved repairing an old section of fencing near the western edge of the property. The sun climbed higher by the hour. By noon, both of us were covered in dust. You ever think about hiring more people? I asked. We do. I mean permanently. Theodore hammered another post into place. It's harder than you'd think. Why? Most people don't stay. They don't like the work. They don't like staying in one place. He looked across the vineyard. I understand. You do? He searched for the words. I hoped someone else might understand why I stayed. The sentence surprised me. I think I do. He looked over. You do? I don't think it's really about grapes. A small smile appeared. No, it isn't. Later that afternoon, Margaret drove out to where we were working. She climbed out of her old truck carrying a large cooler. I brought lunch. Theodore sighed dramatically. You know we packed food. I know. She smiled. And now you have better food. She handed us homemade sandwiches, fruit, and lemonade. I don't know how you do this, I admitted. She looked confused. Do what? Always know exactly where we are. Margaret laughed. I've been watching Theodore disappear into these fields since he was a little boy. She glanced toward him. He always thinks he's farther away than he really is. Theodore smiled without looking up from his work. You make me sound dramatic. You were. I was 6. You cried because one grapevine died. I looked at him. You did. It was one time. Margaret ignored him. He sat beside that vine nearly all afternoon. I thought maybe it was lonely. For a second, Theodore closed his eyes. Grandma. She laughed softly. What? I was little. You were kind. There was a difference. And somehow, I thought Margaret knew it. That evening, after dinner, I stayed outside on the porch while Theodore washed the dishes. The sunset painted the hills orange. The vineyard looked almost unreal. A screen door creaked behind me. Margaret stepped onto the porch carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to me. Mind if I sit? Please. For a while we watched the sunset without speaking. Finally she smiled. He's laughed more these past few weeks. I turned toward her. Theodore? She nodded. He used to. What changed? Her smile became smaller. Life. I waited. She didn't seem in a hurry. After his grandfather passed away, she looked toward the vineyard. Theo convinced himself it was his responsibility to hold everything together. That's a lot. It was. And now? Now he works too much. I noticed. She smiled knowingly. But lately, she glanced toward the kitchen window. He comes inside talking about things that aren't work. I laughed quietly. Like what? You. That caught me completely off guard. Me? He tells me about the mistakes you make. I make a lot. He tells me the questions you ask. I ask too many. He tells me you still can't tell one grape variety from another. I really can't. She laughed. But mostly. Her voice softened. He sounds happy. Before I could answer, Theodore opened the screen door. What are you two talking about? Margaret stood. Nothing important. He looked suspicious. That's never true. She patted his shoulder as she walked inside. You worry too much. Theodore looked at me. What did she say? I smiled. Nothing important. He narrowed his eyes. You're both impossible. The next morning a delivery truck arrived before breakfast. Several large wooden crates had to be unloaded into the winery. Theodore climbed into the truck while I stayed below. Ready? No. Good. The first crate came down. Heavy. Much heavier than I expected. Seriously? I told you they were heavy. You absolutely didn't. I implied it. You definitely didn't. He laughed. Halfway through unloading the final crate, my foot slipped on loose gravel. The crate tilted. I instinctively tried catching it. Preston. Theodore jumped down before I could react. The crate landed safely against another pallet instead of on my leg. You okay? I'm fine. You almost weren't. His voice sounded sharper than usual. I know. He took a slow breath. Don't try catching something that weighs more than you do. I wasn't thinking. I noticed. There was a long pause. Finally, I smiled. You worried? He looked away. I don't like unnecessary paperwork. I laughed. So that's all. Hospital forms are annoying. Right. He still wasn't looking at me. Then, much quieter. And I'd rather you didn't get hurt. The words were simple, matter of fact, but they stayed with me for the rest of the day. Friday evening, after finishing work, Theodore surprised me. Come on. Where? You'll see. We climbed into his pickup truck and drove away from the vineyard. 10 minutes later, he turned onto a narrow dirt road leading uphill. Eventually, we reached a clearing overlooking the entire valley. There wasn't another person in sight. Only open sky. The rows of vineyards stretched below us like green ribbons. I come here sometimes, he said. I've never seen this place. Most people don't know it exists. We climbed out and leaned against the old wooden fence. The wind was cooler here. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, Theodore broke the silence. You know? I wasn't excited when they said someone new was coming. I laughed. I'm honored. I mean it. He smiled sheepishly. I figured you'd quit after a week. Rude. I've seen it happen. So what changed? He looked toward the valley. You stayed. That's all. No. He hesitated. You ask questions. I've noticed. You actually listen to the answers. I looked at him. He still wasn't looking back. And he rubbed the back of his neck. It's been a long time since work felt less like work. The words settled quietly between us. I didn't know what to say, because the truth was, I had been feeling exactly the same thing. Neither of us said another word for several minutes. We simply stood there as the last light disappeared behind the hills. For the first time since arriving at the vineyard, the silence between us didn't feel empty. It felt shared. By the time July arrived, the vineyard had changed. The grapes were larger now. The rows that had looked almost identical during my first week were full of subtle differences I could finally recognize. Some leaves curled differently. Some vines ripened earlier. Some sections stayed cooler because of the morning fog. Without realizing it, I had started seeing the vineyard the way Theodore did. You noticed. I looked up from the row I was inspecting. The leaves. He walked over. You stopped at exactly the right vine. I got lucky. He smiled. No. He examined the grapes beside me. You've been paying attention. I wasn't sure why his approval mattered so much. But it did. More than I wanted to admit. The first harvest workers arrived the following Monday. The quiet little cottage instantly became noisy. For more seasonal workers moved into the empty rooms. Jake, Luis, Owen, Marcus, all around my age. All friendly, all loud. By dinner, the peaceful evenings I'd grown used to disappeared beneath conversations, music, and constant joking. It'll take adjustment, Theodore said quietly while we washed dishes after everyone else had gone outside. I liked the quiet. So did I. For a second, we simply stood there listening to laughter drifting through the open window. It's good, though, he added. Yeah, it means harvest close. I nodded. But somehow, the kitchen suddenly felt much smaller. Not because of the people, because I realized how much I had enjoyed those quiet dinners with only Theodore. The next morning, the entire crew worked together for the first time. The vineyard buzzed with energy. Instructions echoed across the rows. Tractors moved slowly between sections. Everyone seemed to ask Theodore questions every 5 minutes. Theo, which row first? Theo, these irrigation lines okay? Theo, can you check this? He answered every single person patiently. I watched him move through the vineyard with effortless confidence. He never raised his voice, never acted impatient, never made anyone feel foolish for asking. You've got a good boss. Jake appeared beside me carrying a crate. I glanced toward Theodore. Yeah. Jake laughed. Everyone says that. They do. He remembers everybody's name after one day. I smiled. Sounds like him. And he works harder than anybody. Definitely sounds like him. Jake followed my gaze toward Theodore. You two knew each other before this job? No. You act like old friends. The comment lingered with me much longer than it should have. That afternoon, the temperature climbed above 90 degrees. Everyone slowed down. Even Theodore. Margaret drove through the vineyard in her old truck carrying cold lemonade. I refused to lose workers to stubbornness. Nobody argued. We gathered beneath the oak tree for a longer break than usual. Conversations drifted from college to travel to terrible summer jobs. Luis looked toward Theodore. So, you've lived here forever? Pretty much. You ever leave? Sometimes. For vacation? For supplies. Everyone laughed. Jake shook his head. No, seriously. You never wanted city life? Theodore shrugged. I visited. And it's loud. Marcus grinned. That's the point. I prefer hearing birds. You sound 80. Margaret laughed louder than anyone. He always has. Theodore looked dramatically offended. I was standing right here. I know. She smiled. You've been 80 since you were 12. Everyone laughed, including Theodore. I found myself watching him instead of joining the conversation. He looked lighter. The kind of person he probably was before responsibility settled permanently on his shoulders. And I realized something uncomfortable. Seeing him happy made me happy. Far more than it probably should. That evening I couldn't sleep. The cottage felt too warm. Too noisy. Someone was still talking downstairs. Someone else was watching a movie. I stepped outside hoping for fresh air. The vineyard glowed beneath moonlight. Rows of vines stretched into silver darkness. You couldn't sleep either? Theodore stood near the porch railing holding 2 mugs. I made tea. You always know. He smiled. You walk louder when you're thinking. I do not. You absolutely do. I accepted one of the mugs. Thanks. For several minutes we stood quietly. Eventually I asked, do you ever miss having the place to yourself? He didn't answer immediately. Sometimes. Even now. He nodded. I miss conversations. I looked at him. There are conversations. Different ones. He looked toward the cottage. They're good people. They are. But, he smiled faintly. I got used to ours. The words caught me completely off guard. So did I. The admission slipped out before I could stop it. He looked at me. Neither of us looked away. For one strange, suspended moment. The rest of the vineyard disappeared. Then someone opened the cottage door. Theo. Jake stepped onto the porch. We're starting a card game. Theodore blinked. Coming. Jake disappeared inside again. Theodore looked back at me. You playing? I smiled. I don't know the rules. We'll teach you. He held the door open. After you. The card game became an unexpected tradition. Every few nights, everyone gathered around the kitchen table. The games were chaotic. Nobody agreed on the rules. Marcus cheated constantly. Luis complained dramatically every time he lost. Jake laughed so loudly Margaret threatened to throw everyone out after 10. Somehow, Theodore always ended up sitting beside me. Not intentionally. At least, I didn't think it was intentional. One evening Marcus looked between us. You two planning that? What? The same seats. Theodore glanced down at his cards. We sat down. Marcus grinned. Sure. I felt oddly warm. Theodore casually changed the subject before anyone else noticed. But later, while everyone cleaned up, he quietly said, I didn't plan it. I know, but I didn't mind. I looked toward him. He was focused on stacking cards, as if he hadn't just said something that made my heart beat noticeably faster. I didn't mind either. His hand stopped moving for just a second. Only a second. Then he continued stacking the deck. A few days later, Margaret asked me to help organize old storage shelves inside the winery. Dust covered almost everything. Boxes filled with decades of photographs sat forgotten in one corner. Careful with those. Margaret smiled. Family history. I picked up one album. A much younger Theodore smiled from nearly every page. 5 years old, covered in mud, holding tiny baskets of grapes. 10 years old, standing proudly beside an oversized pumpkin. 15, much taller, already helping repair fences. You have every picture. I took most of them. She looked over my shoulder. He never liked cameras. I can tell. He'd smile once. She laughed softly, then immediately asked if we were finished. I turned another page. There was a picture of Theodore beside an older man, his grandfather, both smiling almost exactly the same way. He looks like him. Margaret's expression softened. Very much. He must miss him. Every day. She gently closed the album. The funny thing is, she looked toward the winery window. Theo always worries about taking care of everyone else. She smiled sadly. But very few people remember to take care of him. The sentence stayed with me all afternoon, because the more I thought about it, the more I realized she was right. That evening, everyone else drove into town for dinner. I stayed behind to finish repairing one stubborn irrigation valve. By the time I finished, the sun had already disappeared. You missed dinner. Theodore walked over carrying 2 takeout containers. I brought yours. You didn't have to. I know. I laughed. You say that a lot. Probably. We sat on the tailgate of his truck overlooking the nearest rows of vines. The air smelled like warm earth and summer. For a while we simply ate. Finally I asked, why do you always do that? What? Take care of people. He looked genuinely confused. I don't. You do. I just. He shrugged. If I can make someone's day easier, why wouldn't I? What about your day? He smiled. I'm fine. You always say that. Usually because it's true. Usually? He looked out across the dark vineyard, then quietly admitted, it gets easier when I'm not eating alone. The words landed gently, almost casually, but they echoed inside me long after he said them. Because the truth was, I had started feeling exactly the same way. Harvest began before sunrise. Not officially, not according to the calendar, but everyone at the vineyard knew. The grapes had reached that point where every extra day mattered. The quiet rhythm of summer disappeared overnight. Now everything moved faster. More trucks, more deliveries, more workers, more visitors asking questions. And somehow, even in the middle of all that chaos, I always knew where Theodore was. Not because I could see him, because I could hear him. His voice carried across the vineyard. Never loud, never impatient, always steady. The bins go over here. Take a break if you're overheating. Watch your footing. Nice work. It amazed me how calm he stayed, even when everyone else seemed overwhelmed. One afternoon, we were sorting freshly picked grapes inside the winery. The room buzzed with conversation. Machines hummed in the background. Music played softly from someone's speaker. Jake nudged me with his elbow. So, you and Theo. I nearly dropped the crate I was carrying. What about us? He grinned. I knew it. You knew what? You answered way too fast. I answered a question. You panicked. I absolutely didn't. Jake laughed. Relax. There isn't anything to relax about. MHM. He stacked another crate. You look for him every 5 minutes. I do not. You do. I work with him. You smile differently when he's around. I stared at him. What does that even mean? I don't know. He shrugged. But it's true. Before I could answer, Theodore walked over. Everything okay? Jake smiled innocently. Perfect. Theodore looked from him to me. Should I be worried? Jake picked up another crate. Probably. Then he walked away before either of us could stop him. Theodore sighed. I don't even want to know. I wasn't sure I wanted to know either. That evening we stayed late finishing paperwork. For the first time in weeks, the winery was completely quiet. Everyone else had already gone home or back to the cottage. Only Theodore and I remained. He sat across from me at a large wooden table covered in invoices. I hate paperwork. I've noticed. There has to be a better system. There probably is. I don't want to learn it. I laughed. So the current terrible system wins. Exactly. He leaned back in his chair. You know? I forgot this part. What part? Having someone around after everyone else leaves. The words were simple, but they settled somewhere deep inside me. I like it too. He smiled. I figured. You did. You stop rushing home. I don't really have anywhere to rush. His expression softened. I know. Silence settled between us. Comfortable. Unhurried. The kind that had slowly become ours. The next Saturday, the Vineyard hosted another wedding. Only this one was much larger than the first. Nearly 200 guests. Everyone worked from early morning until long after sunset. By evening, I was exhausted. My shirt was soaked through. My legs hurt. I had barely sat down all day. The reception had just started when Theodore walked over carrying 2 bottles of water. For you. I might actually owe you my life. I'll settle for tomorrow morning. I laughed. Deal. Music drifted across the lawn. Guests danced beneath strings of lights. The bride laughed as someone spun her around. We stood near the edge of the celebration, watching from a distance. They look happy. I glanced toward Theodore. They do. I hope they stay that way. You've become more optimistic. He smiled faintly. Maybe. What changed? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched one older couple dancing together off to the side. They moved slowly, comfortably, like they'd done it 1,000 times before. Finally, he said, I think. He stopped. What? I used to believe people either stayed or they left. And now? He looked at me. Now I think maybe they stay because someone gives them a reason. The world seemed strangely quiet despite the music surrounding us. I wasn't sure if he realized how those words sounded. I wasn't sure I wanted to ask. Someone called his name from across the lawn. Theo. He sighed. I should go. Yeah. He took one step away, then stopped. Don't disappear. I won't. He nodded once, as if that answer mattered. A few days later, Margaret asked if I could help her organize supplies inside the farmhouse pantry. It took almost the entire afternoon. She worked slowly, not because she had to, because she enjoyed talking while she worked. You've settled in. She said it without looking up. I think I have. I knew you would. You did. She smiled. Theodore smiles before breakfast now. I laughed. I don't think that's because of me. It is. She closed another cabinet. He used to eat standing up. Really? He'd finish in 2 minutes and head outside. What about now? He sits. She looked at me. He talks. I wasn't sure what to say. Margaret continued arranging jars. I've spent 28 years watching that boy carry the weight of this place. Her smile softened. It's nice seeing someone make him forget it for a while. I looked toward the kitchen window overlooking the vineyard. I don't think I'm doing anything. Exactly. She smiled again. That's why it works. That night, everyone gathered around a bonfire near the edge of the property. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else made popcorn over the fire. Stories bounced back and forth beneath a sky full of stars. Eventually, Marcus started asking embarrassing questions. Worst date you've ever been on? Groans echoed around the circle. Luis answered first. Jake told an unbelievably dramatic story. Everyone laughed. Then Marcus pointed toward Theodore. Your turn. Theodore shook his head. I pass. No passing. I wasn't dating. Ever. A smile tugged at Theodore's mouth. Not much. Jake looked surprised. Seriously? Seriously. Marcus frowned. That's impossible. I've been busy. Luis laughed. Busy for 28 years. Theodore rolled his eyes. Can we move on? Marcus finally turned toward me. What about you, Preston? I hesitated. There isn't much to tell. No horrible date. There were a couple. What happened? I smiled. Mostly I realized people can seem interesting for exactly 15 minutes. Everyone laughed. Except Theodore. He was already looking at me. Not curious. Thoughtful. Like he wanted to ask something, but knew this wasn't the place. The conversation moved on. But every now and then, I'd catch him glancing my way. Later that night, the bonfire burned lower. One by one, people drifted back toward the cottage. Eventually, only Theodore and I remained. Neither of us seemed eager to leave. The fire cracked softly between us. Finally, he spoke. You never really answered. The date question? He nodded. I guess I didn't. You don't have to. I poked gently at the fire with a stick. It wasn't that dating was bad. So what was it? I never met anyone who felt. I searched for the right word. Easy. Theodore looked into the fire. I know what you mean. You do? He smiled faintly. I've spent a lot of years trying to force conversations. And they always felt like work. I looked toward him. This doesn't. He lifted his eyes. No. His voice was almost a whisper. It really doesn't. Neither of us looked away. The fire continued burning quietly between us. No dramatic moment happened. No sudden confession. No impossible coincidence. Just two people sitting beneath a sky full of stars, both beginning to realize that the easiest part of their day had quietly become each other. Harvest settled into a rhythm that left all of us exhausted. The days were longer, the evenings shorter. By the time we returned to the cottage every night, conversations usually lasted no more than 15 minutes before someone disappeared to bed. Everyone joked that September existed only in 3 stages: work, eat, sleep, then do it again. But even inside that exhausting routine, somehow Theodore still noticed everything. You've got a blister. I looked up from the crate I was carrying. How? You've been holding your hand differently all morning. I didn't even notice. You don't. He reached into the pocket of his work shirt and handed me a small bandage. Here. I stared at it. You carry these? I carry everything. I believe that. He smiled. My grandmother says people work better when they aren't pretending they're fine. She's probably right. She usually is. I wrapped my hand while he waited. Neither of us mentioned how naturally he'd noticed. Neither of us needed to. The harvest reached its busiest week. Trucks arrived before sunrise. The winery stayed active late into the evening. Every hour seemed carefully scheduled. One afternoon, the sorting machine suddenly stopped working. The entire crew froze. Jake looked toward Theodore. Now what? Theodore walked over, crouched beside the machine, removed one panel, and quietly examined the gears. Nobody spoke. 5 minutes later, the machine started again. Everyone cheered. Marcus laughed. I swear you can fix anything. Theodore wiped grease from his hands. Not everything. You've never called a repair company? I have. When I finally admitted I couldn't fix the roof. Louis stared at him. How long did that take? Longer than it should have. Everyone laughed. I noticed something else. While everyone celebrated the machine working again, Theodore had quietly checked that every worker still had water before returning to his own job. He always did that. Always. Without expecting anyone to notice. That evening, rain arrived unexpectedly. Not enough to stop work. Enough to force everyone into the winery until it passed. People spread out across the building. Some cleaned equipment. Others organized supplies. Jake and Marcus argued over music. I found Theodore alone in the barrel room, making notes in a weather log. You escaped. He looked up. For about 3 minutes. Mind if I interrupt? I was hoping you would. The answer came so naturally that neither of us seemed to realize he'd said it. I leaned against one of the oak barrels. You really keep records of every storm? Every storm. Every year. My grandfather started these. He handed me one of the notebooks. The handwriting changed halfway through. Older entries. Then Theodore's. The transition happened almost overnight. You were young. 20. I looked at the pages. You've been doing this 8 years. He nodded. Does it still scare you? What? Being responsible for all this. He looked around the quiet room. I don't think the feeling ever leaves. So why keep doing it? He smiled faintly. Because people are counting on me. And who do you count on? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed the notebook gently. I used to think that wasn't something I needed. And now? He looked directly at me. Now I'm not so sure. Before either of us could say anything else, Jake shouted from somewhere outside. The rain stopped. The moment disappeared. But not entirely. Some conversations have a way of continuing long after nobody is speaking. A few days later, Margaret asked me to drive into town with her. We need supplies. The trip itself took less than 20 minutes. The conversations lasted much longer. As we loaded groceries into the truck, she smiled. So, so, how are you really? I laughed. That's a dangerous question. I know. She closed the truck door. You've been thinking. Is it obvious? To someone my age? She smiled warmly. Very. We started driving back toward the vineyard. Fields rolled past the windows. Finally, I admitted. I wasn't planning to care this much. She kept her eyes on the road. About the vineyard? I hesitated. About leaving? She nodded once. I wondered when you'd realize. I looked at her. You knew? My dear. She smiled kindly. I've been watching people longer than either of you have been alive. Either of us. She laughed softly. Theodore isn't nearly as mysterious as he thinks. Heat rushed into my face. I didn't say. I know what you didn't say. She reached over and gently squeezed my arm. You don't have to explain anything to me. The rest of the drive passed quietly. But my thoughts didn't. That weekend, the vineyard hosted its annual harvest festival. Unlike the weddings, this celebration belonged to the entire community. Families wandered between rows of vines. Children played games near the barn. Local musicians performed beside the tasting room. The place felt alive. Theodore barely stopped moving. Every few minutes, someone called his name. He answered questions, solved problems, directed deliveries, helped elderly visitors carry boxes to their cars. Around late afternoon, I finally caught up with him behind the winery. You've been running all day. I noticed. When was your last break? He frowned thoughtfully. Breakfast. I sighed. Come with me. What? You need food. I'll eat later. No. He blinked. No. No. I pointed toward a quiet picnic table behind the trees. 5 minutes. He looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he followed me. I handed him one of the sandwiches Margaret had packed. You planned this. I learned from the best. He laughed quietly. My grandmother recruited you. A little. He took a bite. Then another. Finally, he smiled. I didn't realize I was hungry. I know. He looked at me over the sandwich. You know? You always forget yourself. For a moment, he simply watched me. Not speaking. Not smiling. Just watching. Finally, he said, Thank you. It wasn't about the sandwich. I knew it wasn't. He knew I knew. Neither of us explained. That evening, the festival ended with fireworks above the vineyard. Everyone gathered on the hillside. Workers, visitors, families. Margaret sat beside several longtime neighbors. The rest of us stood a little farther back. The first explosion lit the sky. Blue, then gold, then deep red. People applauded. Children laughed. For a while, everyone simply looked upward. Without thinking, I glanced sideways. Theodore wasn't watching the fireworks. He was looking at the vineyard below. You okay? He nodded slowly. Yeah. You don't sound convinced. He smiled. I'm just thinking. About how fast summer went. I looked across the rows stretching into darkness. It did. He let out a quiet breath. You'll be leaving soon. There it was. The sentence we'd both avoided for weeks. My contract ends in a month. I know. Neither of us spoke after that. Another firework burst overhead. Green light briefly illuminated his face. He still wasn't looking at the sky. I wasn't expecting this. He said it so quietly I almost missed it. What? You? My heart stumbled. The vineyard? He looked at me then. No. The answer hung between us. Clear enough that it didn't need explaining. Complicated enough that neither of us knew what to say next. Before either of us could find the words, the crowd erupted into applause as the final fireworks filled the sky. The moment passed. But this time, neither of us could pretend it hadn't happened. After the harvest festival, everything changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Nothing happened that anyone else would have noticed. The work continued. The grapes still needed picking. Deliveries still arrived before sunrise. The winery still stayed busy until evening. From the outside, nothing was different. But between Theodore and me, silence had become impossible to misunderstand. Neither of us mentioned what he'd said during the fireworks. I wasn't expecting you. He never took the words back. I never asked him to explain them. Maybe because I already understood. Maybe because I was afraid I understood. The final weeks of harvest arrived with cooler mornings. The first hints of autumn colored the trees surrounding the vineyard. The air smelled different now. Sharper. Cleaner. Almost every evening ended with someone mentioning how quickly the season had passed. Jake sighed while loading another truck. I swear we just got here. Marcus nodded. Feels like yesterday. Luis looked toward me. When are you heading back to school? Early October. So, He smiled. Couple more weeks. The words landed heavier than they should have. Across the yard, Theodore had clearly heard them too. He didn't look over. He simply continued checking inventory. But somehow, his shoulders seemed just a little tenser. That afternoon, we worked alone repairing irrigation lines near the far edge of the vineyard. The rest of the crew stayed closer to the winery. For the first hour, we barely spoke. Not because anything was wrong, because both of us were thinking. Eventually, Theodore broke the silence. You'll be busy. When? After you leave. Oh, classes. Probably. You excited? I considered the question. I should be. But I looked down at the irrigation pipe in my hands. I don't know. He nodded slowly. I know that feeling. You do? You can spend so long working towards something. He tightened another connection. That when you're finally close, you wonder why it suddenly feels different. I looked at him. Exactly. He smiled. I figured. We finished earlier than expected. Instead of heading straight back, Theodore kept driving. Aren't we going home? In a minute. He turned onto the familiar dirt road leading toward the overlook where we'd watched the valley weeks earlier. The truck stopped beside the old wooden fence. Neither of us got out immediately. Finally, he switched off the engine. I wanted to come here again. We climbed out. The valley looked different now. Some sections of the vineyard had already been harvested. Others still shimmered green beneath the afternoon sun. It's changing. I said it quietly. The season. Theodore nodded. It always does. But this year feels. He searched for the right word. Short. I laughed softly. I was thinking the same thing. For a while we stood beside the fence. The wind moved gently through the vines below. Finally Theodore spoke. My grandmother asked me something yesterday. What? She asked if I was happy. I smiled. What did you say? I told her yes. Good. He looked at me. She asked why. And I couldn't answer. I frowned slightly. Why not? Because I wasn't sure when it happened. He laughed quietly. It just. His eyes drifted back across the valley. Started feeling different. I didn't trust myself to speak. So I stayed quiet. After another long pause, he added, I think you had something to do with that. The drive back to the vineyard was unusually quiet. Not uncomfortable. Just careful. As though both of us knew we were standing near the edge of a conversation neither of us had quite reached yet. The following morning, Margaret cornered me before breakfast. Walk with me. We crossed the yard toward the farmhouse garden. She carried a small basket for vegetables. I mostly followed. After several minutes, she smiled. You've been looking thoughtful. Is everyone here secretly psychic? She laughed. No. You just forget your face tells people everything. I should work on that. You could. She picked a tomato from one of the plants. But I hope you don't. I smiled. Can I ask you something? Of course. She continued walking. Did Theodore always know he wanted this life? Margaret didn't answer immediately. No, he didn't. He loved the vineyard. She gently brushed dirt from another tomato. But that's different. How? Loving a place isn't the same as believing you belong there. I thought about Theodore's words from weeks earlier. Maybe choosing something is different from never having another option. He almost left once. Margaret said it quietly. Really? She nodded. Packed his truck. What happened? He unpacked it. Why? She smiled sadly. He said he couldn't leave me here alone. The answer hurt more than I expected. He gave up a lot. He believes he didn't. She looked toward the rows of vines stretching behind the farmhouse. I've always hoped one day he'd choose something for himself. Before I could answer, she looked directly at me. For the first time, her smile became gentle. I think he might. That evening, everyone gathered for one last big dinner before Jake, Marcus, and Louise started leaving over the next several days. The kitchen was louder than ever. Stories bounced across the table. People exchanged phone numbers. Promises to visit someday filled the room. I actually mean it. Jake pointed around the table. If none of you visit, I'm coming back just to annoy everyone. Marcus laughed. You're annoying already. Exactly. Margaret raised her glass. To good harvests. Everyone echoed the toast. And good people. For just a second, Theodore looked at me instead of his glass. Only a second, but it was enough. Later that night, I couldn't sleep again. Not because of the noise. Because the cottage felt strangely temporary. Boxes had already appeared in several bedrooms. People were beginning to pack. The summer was ending. I stepped outside. The air carried the first real chill of autumn. I thought you'd be here. Theodore's voice came softly from the porch. You've started predicting me. I've had practice. He handed me a mug. Tea. Again. You always bring two. He smiled. I've noticed. We walked slowly toward the edge of the vineyard. Moonlight covered the rows in silver. Everything felt still. Finally, I stopped walking. I don't really want to leave. The words escaped before I could stop them. Theodore looked down for a moment, then quietly admitted, I don't really want you to. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us. Not uncertain, not awkward, just honest. I turned toward him. So what do we do? He looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I could almost hear him thinking. Finally, he smiled. A small, nervous smile I had never seen before. I think. He took a slow breath. This is the part where I stop pretending I don't know what I'm feeling. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Theo, I've been trying to convince myself this was just because you were here every day. He laughed softly. That I'd get over it. And I only miss you when you're in another row. I couldn't help smiling. That's oddly specific. I've had months to think about it. He looked directly into my eyes. I like every part of my day more when you're in it. The words were simple. No dramatic speech. No perfect confession. Just the truth. And somehow, that made them mean even more. I stepped a little closer. So, I should probably stop pretending to. He waited. I smiled. I stopped counting this as a summer job a long time ago. His expression softened. When? I honestly don't know. I laughed quietly. Maybe the morning you waited for me because I overslept. That early. Maybe even before. Theodore shook his head, almost in disbelief. I was hoping that I wasn't the only one. You weren't. For a long moment, neither of us said anything else. The vineyard stretched around us exactly as it always had. The night was quiet. The air cool. He reached for my hand slowly, giving me every chance to step away. Instead, I closed the distance myself. Our fingers intertwined naturally, as if they'd already known where they belonged. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. We simply stood there together, looking out over the rows of vines that had quietly changed both of our lives. For the first time in weeks, the future no longer felt like something either of us had to face alone. The next morning felt strangely ordinary. The alarm still rang before sunrise. Coffee still waited in the kitchen. Margaret still reminded Theodore to eat breakfast before walking outside. If someone had watched us from across the room, nothing would have seemed different. Only we knew that everything had changed. When Theodore looked at me, he no longer looked away after a second. And when our hands brushed while reaching for the same coffee mug, neither of us pretended it hadn't happened. There was something unexpectedly peaceful about that. No more pretending. No more guessing. Just honesty. The final week of my contract arrived faster than either of us wanted. One by one, the seasonal workers packed their cars. Jake hugged everyone before leaving. I'll be back next year. Marcus laughed. You say that now. I mean it. Luis shook Theodore's hand. Take care of yourself. I will. Margaret smiled knowingly. Make sure he actually does. Everyone laughed. Before climbing into his truck, Jake walked over to me. So. He grinned. I was right. About what? You smiled differently. I laughed despite myself. You've been waiting months to say that. I absolutely have. He glanced toward Theodore, who was helping load the last few boxes into another truck. He's a good man. I know. Jake nodded once. I think he knows now too. Then he climbed into his truck and drove away. By the end of the afternoon, the cottage was almost empty again. Exactly the way it had been when I first arrived. Only 2 bedrooms were occupied. Mine and Theodore's. The silence returned. But now, it felt familiar instead of lonely. That evening, Margaret invited us both to the farmhouse for dinner. Nothing fancy. Homemade soup, fresh bread, apple pie she'd baked that morning. The 3 of us sat around the same wooden table where generations of her family had shared meals. After dinner, she stood, gathered the empty plates, then looked at both of us. I'm leaving the dishes. Theodore frowned. Grandma, you too can manage. She smiled far too innocently. I suddenly remembered I have absolutely nothing to do upstairs. Before either of us could answer, she disappeared. A second later, we heard her bedroom door close. I laughed. I think we were set up. Theodore smiled. I think so too. We washed dishes in comfortable silence. At one point, he handed me a towel. Our first conversation happened because of dishes. Actually, I smiled. It happened because of coffee. You're right. An aggressive toast. He laughed. I forgot about that. I didn't. I don't think I'll ever live that down. No. I shook my head. You won't. After finishing the dishes, we stepped outside. The vineyard stretched quietly beneath a sky full of stars. Harvest was over. Most of the grapes were gone. The rows looked different now. Resting. Waiting for another season. It's strange. I looked across the hills. What is? The vineyard. It looks empty. Theodore nodded. It always feels that way after harvest. And then winter comes. And after that, he smiled. We start again. The words carried more meaning than either of us intended. Or maybe exactly as much. The following morning, I loaded my bags into my car. There weren't many. Just enough to remind me I'd always planned to leave. Margaret hugged me first. You'll visit. I will. Promise. I promise. She smiled. I'll hold you to it. Then she quietly walked back toward the farmhouse, giving Theodore and me the space she clearly intended us to have. We stood beside my car. Neither of us seemed eager to say goodbye. So, I rested one hand on the roof of the car. So, I hate goodbyes. I noticed. He smiled faintly. I've been trying to think of something smart to say. You? I know. I was surprised too. And he shook his head. I couldn't come up with anything. You don't have to. He looked at me. I don't want to ask one thing. Anything. When classes start. He hesitated. Are you coming back after the semester? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked. If I do. He stepped a little closer. Would you want me to? He looked almost offended. I've wanted that since the festival. I smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. I'm done hoping quietly. The sentence made me laugh. Good. He reached for my hand. This time there was no hesitation from either of us. I don't know exactly how this works, he admitted. The distance. The school. The vineyard. I don't either. I squeezed his hand gently. But we don't have to figure out the whole future today. He nodded slowly. I can do tomorrow. I smiled. You always said tomorrow becomes next week. And eventually, he looked toward the vineyard before meeting my eyes again. Maybe that's forever. I remembered that conversation from the wedding months earlier. Back then, I hadn't understood what he meant. Now I did. Completely. I'll come back. I said it quietly. Not because I need another summer job. His smile grew. I know. I'll come back because. I looked from him to the vineyard stretching behind him. Somewhere between the coffee, the sunrises, the long days, and the conversations beneath that oak tree. I laughed softly. This stopped feeling like a place I worked. He waited. It started feeling like home. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The autumn wind moved gently through the vines. Somewhere in the distance, Margaret opened a farmhouse window, then quietly closed it again, pretending she wasn't watching. Theodore smiled in that calm, genuine way I'd fallen in love with over the course of one unforgettable summer. I'm glad you took the job. It was the same sentence he'd said on the night of the first wedding. Only now, it meant something entirely different. I smiled back. So am I. I leaned in, and we shared a quiet kiss before resting our foreheads together for a moment, neither of us in any hurry to step away. When I finally climbed into my car, Theodore didn't wave immediately. He stood there with one hand in his pocket, the morning sun behind him, looking exactly like he had on the day we met. Only now, I knew him. I knew the man who noticed every changing season. The man who carried bandages in his pocket because someone else might need one. The man who always made an extra cup of coffee. The man who spent years taking care of everyone else before finally allowing someone to take care of him. As I drove down the long gravel road, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The vineyard slowly disappeared behind the hills. But for the first time in my life, leaving a place didn't feel like losing it. Because some places don't stay behind you. They become part of who you are. And sometimes, the summer job you took because you needed money ends up giving you something you never realized you were looking for. Not just a new beginning, but someone who makes tomorrow feel like exactly where you're supposed to be.